Okay, so today we're going to do Chav Zayin Vez. We are in the middle of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. So before we get started, we had said already in the Mishnah, and we repeated yesterday, that we were learning about the carbon top, and we said that there was a requirement for Ma'amades to have Kahanim Levim Yisraelim be standing there at the base of Hamikdash when they brought the carbon. The logic of the Mishnah was, the Mishnah had said, "Lefisha nemar tzavis b'nei Yisrael as karboni lachmi." Pasuk said in last week's parsha, the parsha of the carbon tablet, that the b'nei Yisrael have a mitzvah to bring daily 2 carbon tablets. V'chiheich karboni shel adam karev v'hu eina emin al gabav. How could it be that a person's carbon is going to be brought and he's not standing there? So I wanted to spend a minute on what does this mean? This idea that if you bring a carbon, the person has to be standing there. We have a Gemara. The Gemara tells us in Seita on Chas Amud Aleph, similar to what we said over here, which is the idea that when you bring a carbon, the bailam has to be there. Now, normally when you have a carbon yachid, we're talking about smicha. Right? The pasuk says, "V'samach es yodeh avesh karbonai v'nirtzah lo lechaper olav." There's a ritzu of a carbon when you are doing smicha on it, and so therefore you're required to be there. How can you do smicha if you're not there? That makes sense. But by the carbonus tzibur, the Rambam writes in Hilchos Ma'aser Karbonis that by the carbon tzibur you don't require smicha. There's 3 exceptions, like the carbon of the soyer on Yom Kippur or whatever. There's a couple there's a couple exceptions, but carbon tamid is not one of the exceptions. Carbon tamid doesn't require smicha. So what do we mean when we say that the bailam has to be there? We're not saying that bailam has to be there to get ritzui by doing smicha, because smicha is not required. It's a carbon tzibur. What we're saying is that the bailam has to be there when their carbon is being brought. As the Gemara, as the Mishnah told us, v'chiheich, the lashon of the Mishnah is v'chiheich karbon shel adam karb v'eniyam gabav. That is to say, if it's your carbon, you should be there. The Brisa told us there in Saita, "Ein karbon shel adam karb el im kein ermin al gabav." The same kind of a lashon like we're saying over here. The idea of being there when your carbon is being brought, is that a mitzvah megufa shel adam? Is that a requirement? For example, when it comes to shlichus, right? You can do shliach shalom k'mos. You can make a shliach do various mitzvahs, but you can't make a shliach to put on tefillin for you, right? You can't make a shliach to eat matzah for you. Why? Because those are mitzvahs shebeguf. Only you can do those mitzvahs. You can't have a shliach come along and do those mitzvahs for you. So if it's a situation like this, where we're talking about a carbon, it's not a mitzvah shebeguf that everyone has to be there of Klal Yisrael. Clearly, everybody of Klal Yisrael can't be there. As the Yerushalmi over here notes, the Yerushalmi here in Taanit says, what are we thinking? That we're going to have everybody of Klal Yisrael be there? It says only shalish pa'am b'shani kol zechorcha. Alila regel only required 3 times a year. So maybe you can say, well, everyone should just live there in Yerushalayim. What about basaf of the ganecha? You have a mitzvah to act normal, to be a farmer, to take care of your livelihood. The Torah is not saying something that is not normative in the midst of carbon tamid that would sort of ameliorate or turn off everything else that the Torah says. We're not like sneaking in through the carbon tamid now a way to challenge everything else that we say in the Torah. You have a mitzvah to be normal, to go live a life, to make a livelihood. That's required. So if there's a mitzvah that is required basaf ganach every day, you have a mitzvah of only shalosh pa'amashani kol zechorcha. So it says Yerushalmi, by definition, there was never a thought that the carbon tamid would only be yaitz zayin if all Klal Yisrael was there. So in that sense, it's clear that it's not a mitzvah shebeguf that can only be yaitz if everybody's there. It's a mitzvah that is able to have a shliach be mekayim it for you. When the Rambam writes about the mitzvah of the carbon tamid to the Lamed, in the Essen, it's a mitzvah. It's a mutal on Klal Yisrael. The chinuch, if we're looking at the chinuch on top, man, the chinuch says that, but it's a mutal yotzer al kainim. It's a mitzvah more on the kainim, but it's a Klal Yisrael mitzvah. If it's not done, it could be terrible consequences, like the Gemara tells us in Baba Kama, right? When they had the Karban Tamid every day during the times of the problems between Hurricanes and Aristotle. Still, there was a guy, Zakin Echad, who was a Baki in Chachmas Yivanis, and he said, "Oh, he was Lachash b'Chachmas Yivanis, whatever that means." The Rivash and Shuvas Memhei. So somehow he was pantomiming to them that they shouldn't bring this out anymore, and then it caused they sent up a pig instead, and the land shook. Losing the carbon time is a terrible thing. We're going to see over here on Chav Simon Beis how we manage without the carbon time today. But the first thing to understand is that the mission is how could it be that you could bring a carbon without the bialim being there? It's a fundamental requirement, not just from smicha. Smicha is a requirement that you have to be there, and literally, but it's not a requirement of being there. It's a requirement of smicha. So by definition, you're there. We're saying something different here. It's not smicha. Smicha is not required. It's a carbon tzibur. Smicha is not required at all. There's nevertheless a separate chiyuv that the bialim should be there when their carbon is brought. In that sense, that is a mitzvah shebeguf. If you're the bialim of the carbon, how are you going to make somebody else be there? So when it comes to this carbon tzibur, and actually, I should point out that Rashi in Saita learns it out from the carbon Talmud itself, from Tishmu Li, from the lashon of the pasuk. Whereas carbon the lashon the sefer. I didn't find the sefer. I looked in the sefer to see where Rashi quotes it there in Saita. I didn't see it exactly, but that's what Rashi says. So we literally learning out from carbon Talmud the chiyuv of the bialim to be there when the carbon is brought. The Gemara in Tamur Lamed Beis says that by a carbon tzibur, the gizber has to be there, like the public representative. So for the carbon Talmud, we wanted to have a representative of the Jewish people to be there. Who the representative became? The Mambanis. That's the Rambam writes in Hilchos Mikdash. Perek Vav, he summarizes this Gemara is here. He says that became the way we do it. It's a mitzvah that it's in a sense a mitzvah shebeguf. There has to be somebody there. It can't be everybody there by definition, because it would mean then violating other things that the Torah says about Shalosh Mashana Yerokos Zechorcha or Basaf Ganefa or whatever, as the Yerushalmi points out. So how do we get a situation where you're able to have people there without having people there? The Rashba writes in Chelik Aleph in Siman Sadi Vav, which becomes very relevant by COVID. Can you have a minyan if you don't see the people? Can you have a minyan? Not the distance between people, right? The shul in Alexandria was a huge shul, right? You had to have flags to the more end of Sukkot to shake flags that other people wouldn't know that there was even a bracha because no one hear anything. But what if you're in a room and somebody's in a different room? You have 5 people in one room, 5 people in another room. So we said in Second brachas. We talked, if you remember, it was like nun vavish. The Gemara over there said about being Mekayim Birchas Hamazon. You have 10 people. Can you say Elikenu is they considered one meal? They're in 2 different rooms. The Rashba says if you're in 2 different rooms, it's not a minyan. It's not a minyan. So you have to be there in the place where the thing is happening. So you have to be by the carbon. Again, normally on a mitzvah shebeguf, you have to be there. Here it's Klal Yisrael. So Klal Yisrael has to be there. What's the representative of Klal Yisrael being there? It's the Anshe Maimed. The Anshe Maimed is going to be there. They're going to be the representative of the Jewish people. They have to be. There has to be people there in order to be Yetzis on the carbon Talmud. And we're going to see little in the Gemara today. That's the Machlekes. The Rambam doesn't actually bring this down to halacha. And he doesn't actually say that it's ma'akif. Some Rishonim do say it's ma'akif. If they're not there, it doesn't work. We see in the Gemara here a machlekes on it. But you can understand at least the logic of why. The logic of why is because a mitzvah, a part and parcel of the mitzvah of carbon, is that the bialim should be there when the carbon is being brought. And since it's not possible for all Klal Yisrael to be there, Klal Yisrael creates a constituent representative, a shaliach, the Anshe Maimed of the shaliach, so they have to be there. If they're not there, that would then be a challenge to this idea of having somebody Emin al Gambov, like the Gemara says Shmuel Lamed Beis, the Gemara says Seit Lamed Ches. The Gemara says Seit Ches, that there has to be the owner has to be there, or in the case of the Gemara Tzmura, the Gizber has to be there for a carbon tzibur, or in the case of the carbon Talmud, the Anshe Maimed has to be there. Good. All right. So that's a bit of a background to understanding the line of the Mishnah, we see again and again a few times, which becomes literally the source from here in the Carbon Talmud. All right, so that's the Gemara for today. We are about 5 lines up from the wide lines. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, which literally is a great segue into our topic right now. So Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, Kahanim Levim Israel Ma'akven Asar Karbin. The Kahanim Levim Israel, in other words, the Anshe Maimed, they are Ma'ak of the carbon. If they're not there, then the carbon tamid is not going to be kosher, says Rashi. Kevan the Kulu Bailim, they're all Bailim. Klai Yisrael's the Bailim on this. So Be'inan de Lahavi Kamoyo Agabe Avodah. So they have to be there. There's somebody have to be there, like to do the avodah. They have to be there for this carbon. Says the Gemara, B'masnis the Tanur of Shimon ben Elazar, Kahanim Levim Uklei Shir Ma'akven Asar Carbon. So Rav Shimon ben Elazar says the Kahanim Levim and the Klei Shir, meaning not just the Levim as people, but their instruments have to be there as well. And if they're not, they're ma'ak of the carbon. The Gemara says Ma'ikam Miflagi. So the Gemara says Marsav Iker Shira B'peh, Marsav Iker Shira B'klei. So some say the Iker Shira is with the mouth. Right, I don't know. They used to do some sort of whistling and things like this. That's the Iker Shira, and the other man holds no. The Iker Shira is with a kli. So if the Iker Shira is with a kli, so you can understand why the kli shira also ma'akiv. If you say Iker Shira b'peh, as long as you have the levium, then you will be fine. Says Taisus here. We should lose the Taisus to point out the bottom Taisus on the page. Taisus says that when we say Marsav Iker Shira b'peh, Taisha says, I feel psum, I feel mamzer. If you say Iker Shir is bepeh, so then what's the difference? Who's actually doing it? You could even have a mamzer, a puzzle, to do whatever the singing was. Do have el bepeh? Well, mandam Iker Shir bekli im kain sarach shiu kahanim alevim the ha hakli zemer hayakodesh, because the kli zemer itself was kodesh, and so therefore it would have to be done by a kain or a levi. But here again we have, and while the Rambam, it's not clear to me that the Rambam brings down halakha, here brings down both sides of the debate. It seems like from the Gemara that the having both Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel and Rav Shimon Elazar agree. By the way, it's interesting. Rav Shimon Elazar is a Tana, Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel is an Amira, so they're having them. They're having them being put opposite. They're having them being disagreeing with each other, even though one of the brides is a Taanit Shimon and one is an Amir. How that works, I don't know. But for our purposes now, what we are seeing here is that there is a machlokes as to whether or not the klei shir is ma'akev. But what everyone is agreeing with is what? Is the idea that the Kahanim Levim Israel, the Anshe Maimed, is a requirement there. As we just said, that would fit very nicely with the idea that the bailam have to be by the carbon. That's the Lashon of Rashi over here. Kevan the Kulu bailam. Right? Where's the carbon tamid coming from? From the Chumas Halishka. It's coming from Klal Yisrael's pocket. The Chatzi shekel that was raised every year. This is the public funds, and it's used to pay for the carbon tamid. It's Klal Yisrael's carbon. Who's the representative of Klal Yisrael? It's the Anshe Maimed, so they have to be there. Yeah. Not the Gemara now. Amar Rav Chama bar Guria. Amar Rav. So Rav Chama bar Guria said the name Rav. Moshe Tikkunim L'Yisrael Shmeina Mishmaris. So we're going to have a bit of a debate here exactly, how these Mishmaris were instituted. So Rav Chama bar Guria says in the name of Rav that Moshe Rabbeinu was metaking initially the Mishmaris, and he did 8 Mishmaris. Again, most likely because the amounts of the Jewish people that was there at the time, and whatever was going to be necessary wasn't that you needed more than that. Arba me Elazar, Arba me Samar. Right, 4 from Elazar, 4 from Samar. Obviously, another than Avihu, they didn't either get married or they died too early in order to have descendants to have mishmaris coming from them. Shmuel came along and added it another 8 to make it 16. But David came along and made it 24. We have a pasuk in the Vayam. It says, "Bishnasa Arban Malchus David," in the last year, in the 40th year of David's reign. So this is just a nod to those who study the Navi. You'll notice that there was a common trope. Somebody sent me a a Dvar Torah, I guess, from one of the people running for the government now, for the prime minister, from Naftali Bennett and Parshas Pinchas, that he wrote obviously it wasn't meant as a Dvar Torah so much as it was meant as a shtach to Netanyahu. He said in Pasuk last week's Parsha, Parshas Pinchas, it says, Yifkoi Moshe, it's the only place in the whole Torah where you have a Daber Moshe El Hashem. That always Vaydaber Shem Moshe. It's the only exception was last week's Parsha. What did he ask? Well, Yifkoi Elokim Elokim Ruchos L'chol Basa Isha Ala Eid Asher Yetzi L'fneim Asher Yavu L'fneim Asher Yetzim Asher Yeviyim. Well, you see, I write that the Klai Yisrael shouldn't be Gatsen Asher Ein Lahem Raya. So Hashem says, okay, look, Kachas Yeshua, Masata Moed Chalav, etc. Said this Bennett guy that says, listen, you see in this parsha that the good leader knows how to segue out of his being a leader, knows how to be Mamalamokim. Somebody else should come along and be the leader. So the guy is, I guess, not such a fan of Netanyahu, so he's sending me this word. I wrote him back. I said, I'm not saying I'm a fan of him either, but he still has ways to go, 20 years till he's 40 years. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu is the leader of the Jewish people for 40 years. You go through Shaftim and you will see that all the Shaftim are the leaders of the good ones. They're leaders for 40 years. 40 years is a common trope in Navi. You go through Shaftim, you'll see what I'm talking about. One of the interesting things is to see a lot of times the relationship of various different figures in Tanakh and various different things that we were saying about the Shaftim. You'll see also David HaMelech the leader for 40 years. In that sense, he's operating like a shepherd. That's considered like a wholesome number, a full number for being a leader. But it's not that in Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the leader of the Jewish people at 80 and dies at 120. It's 40 years, a complete number. So the 33 years he ruled over the Jews. So the first 7 years he only ruled in Hebron. So he didn't have, in the beginning he was only ruler of Yehuda and Binyamin, right? Not the whole Jewish people. Then not everybody accepted him. But after that, they all accepted him, right? They came down to Hebron and they asked him to be the king over everybody. So what are we saying? We're saying the pasuk tells us, and they're in the very Mishnah Sarbon Malchus David, in the 40th year of David's reign, Nidushu Vayimotzi B'hem Gibor Achayil B'Yazer Gilad. They found over there the Gibor Achayil and Yazer Gilad. Fine. So what is the is the connection? That's so obvious to make this into David making it to 24 Mishmar, so not 100% clear, but that's how the Gemara is saying it. That pasuk is sort of an indication that he found these Gibor Achayil. He found this. The Gemara thinks that is a remez, this idea that he increased the Anshe the Mishmaris from 16 to 24. This is what Chama Bar Gura is saying in the name of Rav. Fine. So it's the Gemara question now. The Gemara wants to slug up this idea that it went from 8 to 16 to 24. Yeah, so Maceface Dr. Gemara, I'll ask you a question. We have a price that says Moshe Diklam Lishol Shmeina Mishmaros Arba Me'elos of Arba Me'samar. So you see, similar to what we just said, that Moshe Rabbeinu was matakin the first Mishmaros, he did 8. But David Shmuel V'Amidin Alasim V'Arba Shnam Hema Yasa David Ushmuel Haray B'Menasim. Again, another pasuk there in Divrei Yamim. Pasuk says that David and Shmuel, who is known. Shmuel is known as a raya. If you look at the beginning of Shmuel, over there the pasuk says that lefanim b'Yisrael before it was known as a navi. A navi was called a raya. What is a raya? A raya is a seer, somebody who sees the future, and that's why over there Shaul was going to look for his donkey. So he's looking for Shmuel haraya. So that's why we call him a raya. Hema Yasa David Shmuel haraya b'Amunasam. Right. So what does that mean? As Rashi points out over here, this is a tiyufta. Why? Because if you look at Rashi says the tiyufta the Rav Chama. Why? Because it says over here that Shmuel and David did it together, that they were miyased this new mishmaris to 24. It wasn't that Shmuel did 16. Moshe did 8, and now you see David and Shmuel partnered up together to make it 24. So there wasn't this intermediate stage where Shmuel did 16. It was always 8 and then 24. And Shmuel and David did it together. We had at the beginning of Taanit, if you remember, we were discussing way back, on the way back machine, if you remember, we discussed, what do you call it? We discussed on Ham and Bays, we discussed the fact that Shmuel didn't want to die after Shaul. He didn't want to see Ma'aseh Yadai. He's the one who built up Shaul to become the leader. Now he's going to see him die. He didn't want that. He wanted to die before Shaul, but he also didn't want to die right now. So Hashem had to work it out that Shmuel's going to die, then Shaul's going to die, and David's going to take over. David has to take over at a certain time. David never makes it the shtadlus to take over, but Hashem has to arrange the time. So Rashi over here points out that it's Yivta Rav Chama because he said that Shmuel did only 16. And here we see David did 24. And then Mashma that they did it together. Hema Yisa David Shmuel right Bemenos. Again, the Pashup Shalom Puzzle has nothing to do with the Mishmaris, but the simple understanding is that they worked on something together, that they were miyased something, or they miyased together, the Mishmaris, to make it 24. That we then have a question of Cham Bar Gura, and the Gemara then says that we have to try to answer by saying like this: Hachi Kamar. No, it's not like a sestira of Cham Bar Gura. He was just simply saying that the David and Shmuel, here we call him Shmuel Masi, he comes from Rama, which Rama, can't get into that right now. That was done at 24. It says Rashi, Miseda Shel Shmuel Masi She'emidan al Yud Vav. So Rashi gives two options. The first option is Miseda Shel Shmuel Masi She'emidan al Yud Vav. He did 16, but David Emidan al Chav Daled, and David used that to base himself to make it 24. That's one option. However, I think the simple way of reading is like the second part of Rashi, which is Isfar. There's a different version. Shekaz the Bemi Miseda Shel Shmuel David. Midam al Chavdal Klema Shneim Ha'ilu B'Davar Shmuel Hamidam al Yudvav V'Davar al Chavdal. They work together. Shmuel did initially 16, David eventually 24, but it's not a steer. You're not asking me a steer. It's slugging over Cham Bar Gura. Everyone agrees that there was essentially a progression in the Mishmaris. It went from 8 to 16 to 24 as the Jewish people increased exponentially in size, and Moshe, Shmuel, and David were all partners in this endeavor. Fine, Tanya Idach, another price is similar to this, says as follows: Moshe Tikkun Lam Yisrael Sheish Esrim Mishmaris. Moshe Rabbeinu has been talking 16 Mishmaris. So over here in this version, we're saying that it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu doing 8, but rather Moshe Rabbeinu doing 16. So okay, if Moshe Rabbeinu did 16, so then had to get 16. Shemana Mei Elazar, Shemana Mei Isamar. Again, that's all there was at that time. So you had to make Mishmaris from Elazar and Isamar. How many kids Elazar and Isamar had? I don't know. If they each had 4 kids, I don't say you get 8 Mishmaris. Obviously, they had to have a lot of children. The only way that this would make sense. Yes, even though from the Torah we don't know about it. It must have been they had a lot of kids. Yeah. So Zot the Gemara, Rabu b'nei Yisrael. I'm sorry, b'nei Elazar b'nei Samar. And over time, the b'nei Elazar and became much more of a larger family than the b'nei Samar. So then Cholkom v'amidim alasim v'arba. So then they turned it into 24 mishmaris. So again, according to this understanding of this brisa, Moshe Rabbeinu is not talking 8 mishmaris; he's been talking 16 mishmaris from Elazar and Isamar, Shneimer, and then later on it becomes 24 when Elazar becomes a much larger family than Isamar. Shneimer v'yimtzu b'nei Elazar rabim l'rosh yibar min b'nei Isamar v'yechalkom l'b'nei Elazar. So the what do you call the pasuk there in Divrei Yamim says that b'nei Elazar become rabim. They become much more than the Bnei Samar. And by Chalkum, Levnei Elazar, Rashim, Leveis Avish, Shisha Asav, Levnei Samar, Leveis Avaisim Shemaina. And so they end up that Elazar has 16 from the group, and the other 8 come from Isamar. So the Mashmayis here is Moshe Rabbeinu has been talking 16, eventually becomes 24 when Elazar grows much larger than Isamar. We have another pasuk there in Divrei Yam that says, "Beis Av Echad Achuz LeElazar, ve'Achuz LeIsamar." And there was one Beis Av, right, for Elazar, and then one of Isamar. In other words, it was basically like a smaller percentage, like it was double that for Elazar as it was for Isamar. It comes out then that if Elazar is 16 and Isamar is 8, so you understand how you get to 24 and you see the double of Elazar over Isamar because it was a much larger family than Isamar. Says the Gemara, Maiva Aimer, why do I need to have another pasuk that gives me this proof? Aren't you already showing me from the first pasuk there? Vayimsu b'nei Elazar, Rabim l'Rosh Hagavar, b'nei Samar, v'chalkim l'bnei Elazar, Roshim l'beis Avos, Shisa Asar, l'bnei Samar, l'beis Avos, and Shemona. Aren't you already showing me that there's a difference between 16 and 8, that they're much greater? Why do you have to have the second one that says, by the way, this we're going to have this also in this week's parsha, right? Echad Ofaz al Chamishim. We're going to have also percentages. And in last week's parsha, fractions, right? Shisa Tahin, Levit Tahin. So this week also we're going to have in this week's parasha when the Jews come back from the war about Midian, and over here as well we see right for every percent of Elazar getting, like 0.5% is going to Isamar. So why do I need to have a second pasuk? And they already covered that in the first pasuk. Says the Gemara, no, Samar. So maybe you're going to think that, the Bnei Summer also ended up getting very large. And so the same way the Bnei Elazar got bigger, eventually Bnei Summer got bigger too. And so, so then they eventually also were 8. And from the initial, what you thought was 4, they were really going to end up being 8. So if it was 8 and then we both become 16, that wouldn't work. So you would end up having to figure out a different number. You would, in order to get to 24, you would each one was 12 or something like that. So the Gemara is saying maybe that's what you would think. No, Tashma Beisav Echad Achaz Alaz VeEchaz Achaz LeIsamar. So there was always going to be a doubling. There was always going to be a half of a percentage on the Isamar for Alaz. So Alaz is going to be becoming 16. So Isamar is going to be 8, and that's how you get to 24. So that's a big kasha then on Rav Chama Bar Giura, right? So you have to do Rav Chama Bar Giura. Why? Because of the fact that you saw by him, he started out at 4. He said Moshe was matakin 8 mishmars, 4 and 4. And over here you see that no, it ends up that his summer was much smaller than Elazar, and Moshe Rabbeinu didn't do a 4 and 4. He did a 16. He did much larger. So again, it's not. Don't ask me questions. It says Tanoi. It's really machlokes Tanoim as to exactly how many mishmaros Moshe Rabbeinu set up initially. And I hold that Moshe Rabbeinu initially set up 8, not 16. Okay. Either way, what we end up taking out from this Gemara is, number one, that the mishmaros goes all the way back to the beginning, that Moshe Rabbeinu was already setting up the mishmaros. Number two, that Elazar was a much larger family of Kahanim than Isamar. And we could quibble on the edges about how many mishmaros were set up initially by Moshe, by David, by Shmuel. That we have different opinions on in terms of the history, the shalshalas of how you got to the mishmaros. But one thing is clear, is that when the mishmaros were running as normal, there was in the first and second Beis Hamikdash, there was always 24 mishmaros, and those 24 mishmaros always got 2 weeks a year, which meant 48 weeks. That was covered. Every mishmar got 2 weeks each. And on the Yom Tovim, they all had to be there. So that's how you covered off on the year. And now we talk about a topic that is a relatively bitter one, and is always one that comes up around for 3 weeks. That's the Gemara Tanarabban Arba Mishmaris Alu Min HaGoyla. The Jewish people didn't make Aliyah. Says Rashi over here, only 4 mishmaros came up from the Golos Ve'elohein Yad Yecharim Pashchar Ve'emud. There are 4 of the famous names. If you look in the kinais that we have on Tishba, we'll see the names of the various mishmaros. And Rashi says, look at the Rashi, Alu Min HaGoyla. What does that mean? Ve'ashar loy alu. The rest of the Jewish people, the rest of the Kahanim, did not make Aliyah. Shahar ben Yisrael nishtayiru v'lei rotzu lalis. Because many people remained in the Golos and refused to make Aliyah. Like I said, without getting into details now, it is definitely something that we should just mention. Like the Gemara tells us in Testament based on the bottom, that Rish Lakish refused to talk to a certain rabbi. It's not 100% clear exactly who it was, but a Babylonian rabbi. And he said this, that Stanley, I hate you. Why? Because you didn't make Aliyah at the time that you should have made Aliyah at the time. Israel needed Jews to come back, and you didn't. And by the way, the Gemara's there in Kedushin, right, tell us that the Levim were punished, right? A lot of them didn't make Aliyah, but Levim also were nisrashal in making Aliyah, and they were punished, right? So the matanas for Levim, giving ma'aser to Levim was taken away from them. It was given to the Kohanim. as a result of this. So also here the Kahana were punished for not making Aliyah. And what happened? Only four families of Kahana made Aliyah. So what about the rest of the families? Says the Gemara, the Nevi'im Shebineim, the Nevi'im who were there at the time. Remember, this is the end of the period of the Nevi'im. We turn the page now to Chazdayin and base. Chagai Zechariah Malachi, right? This is the end of the Nevi'im. There's not going to be any more Nevi'im after this. It's going to be now the Anshin Nesagadolah. But there's no more Nevuah, right? We've already said and Nebuah has to end, right, at the time when the miracles end, and the miracles had to end because the Yitzhar of Avodah Zarah was ending when human time of passed, right? That leads us to the Gemara tells us in Yom Test. We just said that even though Nebuah was ending at Daim Shtam Shem Basko, the Gemara in Bas Yud Beis that tells us that Nebuah Man Hanavim and Chachamim. So there's no more Nevuah anymore. Now we have only Chachamim. So what happened? What did they do? They took these four mishmaris of Kahanim that had returned from Bavel, and they turned them into 24. In other words, they said each one of these four becomes now its own family, and we divide it now into 24, meaning each one of these families gets six. Right? Each one of these families gets six mishmaris. So practically what that means is they end up getting a lot more than they would have gotten. They would have normally gotten, if it was a family, they only got 2 weeks a year. Now they're getting six mishmars, so effectively getting 12 weeks a year, right? So they're becoming a much larger percentage because there was less people that were here. So it says the Gemara, how did that work? Bottle of us and Kalpi, they put lots in in the box. He took his own chelik and the other mishmars that are not returned. And he ended up taking six chalakim, six mishmaris, b'achar v'nat chalka v'chalak chaver sheish, v'chein pasha v'chein emor. V'chein isnu nevi'im shebineim. And so the nevi'im made the following declaration among them: Sha'afilu yahirev, that which is like the main of the mishmaris, the first one. Right? We talk about the kinais, reish mishmaris. Even if he returns, if he changes his mind, and eventually decides to come back, well, yidcha yad yamim kaimai. Yad is going to remain the main one. He's going to still get the first mishmar. Again, practically, I'm not sure exactly how that was impacted, but he got first dibs, and only after, right, these sort of the mishmaris that came back got their first dibs. Then you're going to have the ones that come back later. Then they're going to be allowed to do their thing. So they're allowed to get a mishmar. Right, so the families the new ones that came back, would take away from the six, right? Because remember, they didn't get a real six; it was really them taking their own, and then five of the other ones. So if families came back, they would take away. Now, only one family came back. Which one is the one that loses? I don't know. But the basic idea would be that they would all have to contribute from theirs, but they wouldn't go now lower in importance. Since the four had come back, they get the top job. Fine, let's continue the Gemara to two dots. So V'Yisrael Shabbos Mishra Wisconsin Marim Mekar B'Ma'aser Bereshis. So the Gemara says that where did he get this idea? In the middle of the year, the Anshe Ma'im, they're coming to the shul, right? Remember the ones who are not in Yerushalayim, and they're reading Bereshis. Why are they reading Bereshis? Minani immediately says the Gemara, Amar of Yaakov Barach, Amar of Asi, El Molim Ma'amades Le'Neskayim B'Shamayim V'Aretz. Because if not for the Ma'amades, it would not be a world. What do we mean? There would not be a world. Shne'emar V'yem Hashem Lekim B'Mo'ida Ki Roshana. Right? Remember, Avraham Avinu says to Hashem, "How do I know that I'm going to, in fact, get this inheritance in the land of Israel?" Amar Avraham Avinu Shem Yisrael Chaytin L'Fanecha. Maybe the Jews are going to end up sinning. Ata Islam Kedar Mabul Kedar Flaga. You're going to end up punishing them like you do the Dar Mabul, the Dar Flaga. Amar Lav. So Hashem says, "No, you don't have to worry about it. I'm not going to do that to them. I'm not going to destroy the world again." Again, we said already in the Dar Mabul. Hashem says he's not destroying. Hashem says, I'm not going to bring another mabul, right? Zera v'katza v'kar v'chayim v'kayitz v'yom v'layla, right, etc. The pasuk there tells us in Parashas Noach that Loish Bois is not going to stop. It's going to remain. It's going to remain 4 seasons. It's going to remain a world as we know. Hashem's not bringing another mabul. L'hakis says kol chai kasher osisi. So he says, okay, so I say you're not going to destroy the world, but how do I know that I'm really going to inherit all of this good stuff? I understand you're not destroying the world, but how do I know I'm going to actually get Eretz Yisrael and all the promises? What does Hashem respond to him? Amar le, Choli, Eglam Mishaleshes, Ve'ez Mishaleshes, Ve'ayim Mishaleshes, Sar, Ve'goyzel. Remember, we had to bring by the covenant of the parts, by the brisbane of the sun, we had to bring these various different animals and make the thing. So what did Hashem effectively tell him? Amalafonov. So that means Hashem is telling you that you bring these karbanos and everything's going to be good. Meaning, what we're saying is that the carbon tamid, you bring that and everything will be fine. So I understand that if we bring karbanos, you're going to be happy. But what happens if there's no bias, if there's no karbanos? So what's going to be? So Amar Loik, Vartikantalam Seder Karbanas. Bisman Shekarim Behen Lefanai Mala Alni Aleim Kilu Hikrivam. So long as they read the Seder Karbanas, so long as they still say it, that's like I'm going to consider like they brought it. I'm going to forgive them for all of their sins. And this is very interesting, right? Because this is that Gemara that we had in Brachas Chav Dalet about the Machlekes, about if the Tfilas were Avos Tiknam or Tfilas were mitakim because of the karbanas. Here, what we're literally saying is that Abraham Avinu was begging Hashem to know how is it going to be that the Jews will really get the land of Israel. And Hashem says, "Oh, because of the karbanas." And when there's no karbanas, the Seder karbanas is going to work for them. So even Abraham Avinu, what we're saying, according to the sheet that says that the tefillos are avos tiknam, is still dependent on the karbanas when there's not going to be what do you call it? There's not going to be karbanas anymore. We still need the tefillos, which are all Seder karbanas. And in fact, yes, Avraham Avinu might have been attacking it, but it's predicated upon the idea that there will be karbanos, or if there won't be karbanos, that there will be a seder karbanos that will still say. Yeah, and that does give some level of importance to saying karbanos. The Anshe Mishmar would would daven for their karbanos that were being brought, that they should be accepted. Baratzin, so the Anshe Mishmar, they would daven. Right, those are the kahanim themselves. They would daven that the karbanos should be accepted. Remember, they would come into the Bate Knesias even outside Yerushalayim, and they would sit there for 4 taniyas. They would be davening for those that are on business trips. That kids shouldn't die of SIDS and things like that. They were down for that the kids should be all healthy. They're down for all the people that are traveling. And then they wouldn't fast on Erev Shabbos. Why? Because of the covenant of Shabbos. The covenant of Shabbos, as we said, I don't know about. But one thing's for sure, the covenant full on Shabbos, 100% wrong. The covenant fasting on Shabbos, wrong. Moderate amount that a person should come into Shabbos. So he shouldn't be starving, and he shouldn't be full. Yeah. So Kavakam Shabbos obviously they didn't fast on Shabbos itself. Shabbos, so why not? They didn't fast on Sunday. So my time, why don't they fast on Sunday? Very fascinating. Maybe we'll talk tomorrow a little bit if I'll spend some time talking about the Christians. But this is literally a open Gemara because of the Christians. The Christians prevented us from fasting on Sunday. Why? Because Sunday was their big day. If we ended up fasting on Sunday, they would say, "Oh, you see, it's because they believe in Him." You know, the Yashki guys, they will take anything as a proof. So we're fasting. It means that we respect Him. Because the third day of Ma'aseh Bereshis, the third day, people, were in the biggest vulnerable state on the third day. Fine. And then we have the most famous one, Shlagasham of Nation, Shami Yisera, the Amr Shlagish and Shami Yisera, Nitna by Adam, the Erev Shabbos, and everybody gets in the Shami Yisera and Erev Shabbos, my third Shabbos, Nitna Samimeno, they take it away, Shanam Shaz by Nafash, the Kivan Sheshavas Vai of the Nefesh, right? When it's taken away, it's going to be a big Aveda. So if you look back at our Mishnah, that's probably the closest mashmayas is that if you're going to end up fasting on Shabbos, so if you end up fasting on Sunday, to go from Shabbos to Sunday, again, that would maybe fit easiest with Rish Lakish. We'll stop here.